Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our Q2 Manufacturing Outlook webinar today. I'm Richard Austin, BDO's Head of Manufacturing. When we caught up in Q4 last year, things were looking pretty dreary, but since then in Q1, volumes have started to pick up again. And the economy and I think manufacturing in general is starting to see a far more calmer environment within which to operate, especially since the pandemic kicked off in 2020. So it will be interesting to see how the numbers have stacked up since Q4 and whether things have moved on from Q1 and how they've moved on. And to do that, we're delighted to be joined by Make UK Senior Economist, James Brougham, who will be providing some high-level manufacturing and an economic update based on the Q1 reports and Q2 outlook as well. Following that, we will be joined by Sandi Dosanjh, who's a partner in our digital advisory services team here at BDO. UK manufacturers are experiencing an increased focus on digital transformation and using that to really drive efficiency and greater productivity. But with digitization comes complexity, and those programs can often be quite difficult to manage. So Sandi will be sharing her insights on that in terms of how digital transformation works in the manufacturing sector, and also some of the pitfalls as well, but also the benefits and what manufacturers might want to look at and think about if they are planning to go through a digital transformation process. As always, the discussions will be followed by a live Q&A. So please do submit any questions that you may have through the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen, and we will pick those up at the end of our conversation. With that, I will hand over to James. James, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to this webinar of our presentations on the findings of the second quarter of our Manufacturing Economic Outlook research for 2023. As Richard alluded to at the start, it comes as on the back of a rather surprising quarter in the first quarter of the year. As Richard mentioned, at the end of last year, analysts ourselves and the wider industry itself, which we'll see in the data in a couple of slides' time, was quite confident that the first couple of quarters of this year would see the industry continue into that recessionary territory. Much to the benefit of the sector, we now see that has not been the case in the first quarter, and indeed in this second quarter research and this data I'm going to be focusing on today, we can see that momentum of moderate positivity is indeed continuing, subverting those expectations that were set throughout the second half of last year. So if I can have the first slide, please. So here we have the overview. What I'll do is I'll go through a brief overview now, and then we'll interrogate some of the individual metrics, and I have some graphs to highlight the points I'm going to be making. But first of all, we see output and order performances roughly consistent in terms of the scale of positivity of those balance figures compared to last quarter. Where orders are concerned, in terms of the breakdown of UK and export orders, the balance between the two has become even, when typically for the past 6 to 7 quarters, we've seen UK orders has been leading export orders. However, this could just be a quarterly blip in the data, and we'll have to see into the expectation, particularly for the expectation next quarter. Manufacturers don't expect that balance to continue, and they expect UK orders to remain dominant over export orders. One of the main sideshows of this research over the past 2 years has been our margins and prices metrics, particularly because prices, that's manufacturers' price setting behavior, has been at such elevated levels for 6 to 7 quarters, but margins have remained in decline. What we're seeing now is margins, despite remaining just in positivity with a very marginal negative balance figure, the trend is now by next quarter, and certainly the expectation from industry is that on aggregate by next quarter, we're going to have a positive balance figure for margins. So that is very good news for the sustainability of an industry, which is, as the data shows, and it's illustrated quite well on the graph we'll see in a couple of slides' time, that has suffered that long period of relationship between high prices but falling margins. Labor demand is still a challenge. The manufacturers are still managing to fill roles, so we're still seeing employment growth, but of course the appetite is still not being satiated. The appetite for labour within the industry is still very high. There's of course a long-standing systemic issue with a labour shortage in the UK manufacturing industry. However, it is still more severe today than that long-term average over the past 20 years at about 50% over the long-term average in terms of the average level of demand. And I'll talk about a bit more about that in the appropriate slide. It follows, given this consistent output and orders performance compared to last quarter, confidence has remained steady and positive. Actually, business confidence has remained almost roundly unchanged in its positive figure last quarter to this quarter, but we do see the confidence in the overall UK economy increase a bit, which follows given a period of stability. As a result of this, our outlook and our forecast for 2023 for both the manufacturing sector and the wider UK GDP have been revised upwards. Of course, you can see there for 2023 still in negativity at a marginal minus 0.5%. We've raised these consecutively now for about 3 quarters, indicating the improvement in the outlook for 2023's performance. However, 2024 forecasts have remained roundly unchanged, which reflects the improvement in optimism is limited to the short term and not so much so the medium to longer term. So if we have the next slide, please. So here we have output and orders, and that's illustrated by the red bar being the balance of change for output and the orange bar being the balance of change for orders. Now, I always say at the start when I start showing these graphs that it's important that these aren't interpreted to be absolute terms. So an orange bar roughly at say 20% does not indicate a 20% increase in the volume of orders. What it does represent is the proportion of the sector on balance that reports having seen their orders increase compared to last quarter, compared to the previous quarter, and this similarly for output. So you can see here on the far right in the two sets of bars on the far right, what I was mentioning earlier about we have that relative level of consistency. And from a brief glimpse at this about 8-year time series running from 2018 to 2023, you can see that actually, even though it's only been 2 quarters of that relative stability in these metrics, this is the first time this has really happened since 2018, just on this 8-year time series. And of course, manufacturing outlook data in this form goes back 30 years. So if you could have the next slide, please. This is a breakdown between that orders bar between the UK and export orders, where you see that green highlighted box, and in future slides as well. That indicates manufacturers' expectation for the next quarter, so i.e. the 3rd quarter of the year. That is not something that we as the economists have forecast or adjusted. That is effectively the raw industry data on aggregate that we've asked, what does the immediate near term in any given metric look like? And we see there that while we do in the set of bars just to the left of the green box, we see the balance between UK and export orders is flat after quite a while of the red bar effectively leading the orange bar. There is the expectation that this will just be a temporary blip, and by next quarter, UK orders will continue to lead export orders. Why this is of interest is, of course, there's a lot of questions about, are we observing the systemic ongoing effects of the UK's new trading relationship with the European Union, of course, the UK manufacturing sector's largest trading partner. But there's another significant aspect at play here to do with supply chain assurity and the nature of reshoring and nearshoring activity, not necessarily permanent, but certainly in the short term that's been very observable as manufacturers have effectively scrabbled to get input in so the product can get out the door, and perhaps moving supplies which may have typically come from the east due to longer lead times, more uncertainty in that ability to deliver, moving supply chains closer to home despite perhaps increased cost in order to keep the wheels turning. So some of that is at play in boosting UK orders over the past year and a half or so as well. We can have the next slide, please. Now, this chart illustrates the relationship between expectations and what actually comes to pass based on those output and orders. So it's effectively the same data that we saw in that very first slide. And if I could draw your attention to the right, you see that the bars are effectively what manufacturers expected to happen in that quarter. So i.e., if we look at the far right bar, the bars there for output and orders are what manufacturers expected their balance figures to be in the 1st quarter of the year, and the dots are where they actually came to be. So I think the most interesting highlight here in more recent quarters is we see in the penultimate grouping of bars there in 2023 Q1, you see that the dots are significantly in positivity, while the expectation, you might be able to just see a little slither of bars underneath the zero line there, which continues a trend of reality seen throughout 2022, if you can see through those dots, going down. And that's what I was talking about at the start, about that sort of pessimistic confidence that that the sector was heading into that negative territory for the start of the year. What we can see is actually those negative expectations were seriously subverted by the scale of the positivity of those two dots in that 2023 Q1 column there. And what we see now in 2023 Q2 is actually the expectation was pretty much much more squarely on what has actually come to pass in this data. And why this is important is, of course, because that's that predictability and that consistency that is testament to a business environment that may very well be stabilizing, especially if we get to that position where manufacturers can successfully predict and then deliver on those expectations quarter to quarter. Indeed, I should mention, as we've seen in the previous slide, the expectation as well for the third quarter of the year is at about this level as well. And so particularly if by the time of the third quarter of the year rolls around and that data comes in, if we see that consistency again, that's further testament to that effective predictability, consistency within the UK's manufacturing industry in the past quarter or two quarters that hasn't really been observable for the past year or so. Especially if you look back around the 2022 Q1, 22 Q2 areas, you can see the bars aren't really lining up with the dots. And that is evidence of uncertainty playing out there. Next slide, please. As I mentioned at the start, one of the most major interesting points of our research over the past couple of years has been our prices metric and our proprietary margins metric as well. So what the bars represent here is that quarter-to-quarter price setting behavior from the manufacturing sector in terms of their UK prices and export prices, the red and orange bars respectively. And then the lines underneath, we have a light blue bar, which represents UK margins, and a darker blue bar that represents export margins. And you can quite obviously see here on the right that the colored bars are very, very high, especially while margins are in decline. And even again, in only this 8-year time series that's on screen, where you can see those bars on the right are at their highest point at around 2020, about the start of 2022, that's actually the highest ever balance figure for UK prices that Manufacturing Outlook Work has recorded in its 30-year history. And we can see that even if we move along to the right just before the green bar, we can see that for argument's sake, those levels of prices are still very, very high. We can see they have cooled a little, but especially even compared to this 8-year time series, that level is still right up there near the peak. So what does this mean, or what does this mean for the sector? Well, over the past year or so, or past 2 years, what it's meant is that manufacturers have been setting their prices on a quarter-to-quarter basis at the fastest rate ever recorded, really in the past 30 years. But at the same time, margins have been in decline. So how can this be? And of course, this is evidence that the rate of which the input prices for the sector and production costs for the sector have been increasing, have outpaced their ability to price that cost on, whether able to or want to, into their final product, which leads to this relationship that we see here is we have highest ever price rising activity, despite margins in that time continuing to not just decline, but also worsen. Now moving on to the right-hand side of those lines, we can see that actually margins are now, the trend is going upwards. Of course, they still remain in negativity on aggregate. And even with today's data, which you can, if you had a magnifying glass, you could just see to the left of the green highlighted box, we can see that especially that export margin bar is just in negativity. But we see that expectation as those lines move into the green box that by next quarter, margins are going to turn to positivity. And the reason why we put a fair amount of stock in this expectation is, of course, you would have noticed on the previous slide, I was talking about that predictability being realized, and indeed that demonstrable predictability. And if we see that again in the coming quarter, that gives us that weight to put faith in that this expectation that margins will move into positivity next quarter, given this data. Of course, as well, as part of this green box, you can see that the expected price setting behavior for manufacturers, both UK and export prices, is expected to continue, but at a slightly lower rate, but still quite positive by this 8-year time series. And I suppose I wouldn't put too much stock in it, but we do see an interesting slight disparity in that expectation between UK setting prices and export prices that perhaps hasn't been as pronounced since the first quarter of 2022, where we see a slight unbalance between actually UK prices being higher in terms of that setting behavior than export prices. Next slide, please. So it follows, of course, that confidence, as I mentioned at the start, in their steady, if the metrics are coming through at a steady performance, then UK business performance, and that's manufacturers' confidence in their own business on aggregate, remains steady. And we see a pretty much flat red line there between the first quarter and the second quarter of the year. And what we see in UK economic conditions is a small shift upwards. It would follow with the narrative that, of course, that consistent performance would have your confidence in your business performance remain positive but stable. But if we see that consistency over a period of time, quarter to quarter, then of course the nation's manufacturers' confidence in the wider UK economic conditions will improve in kind. Next slide, please. So our final metrics is in our investment and employment. Now, the red bars here represent the balance of change for employment and the orange line for investment. And I'll start with employment here. And what that expectation in that green box on the right represents is effectively the sector's appetite to employ. So that is very unlikely to be realized despite that expectation being set. That simply illustrates the demand there is in our data for labor that manufacturers can't get a hold of. What we're seeing, though, to the left there is we see employment growth bars that you can see are far greater in terms of balance than the three previous quarters that precede it. And indeed, that's shown in national statistics vacancies data as well. In the first quarter of the year, there were 77 live vacancies in manufacturing. That has dropped a little bit down to 72,000. But you combine that with their employment growth data, and we have evidence to suggest that it's because those roles have been filled. Now, at the end of the year, 2022, Q3, Q4, what we saw a very high level of vacancies, but actually, and then they dropped suddenly, but it wasn't because they were filled. It was because in that expectation of a downturn, hiring activity ceased at the end of the last year, but also a lot of open roles were closed, having never been filled. We also have, if we take that vacancies data and look at it by ratio, and I mentioned earlier about that demand being 50% higher than the long run average, we saw a peak in July of last year in terms of, so for every 100 manufacturing jobs in the sector, 4 were vacant. So essentially, effectively as a percent. And now we're right the way down now into about 1.9, I believe, or about 3, 2.9, that's the figure, 2.9, so effectively 3, coming from 4. Now that long run average for that percentage going back 25 years is at 2. So when we're at that height of July last year at 4% vacancy, you could say that demand for labor in the sector was twice as feverish as it is in the long run average. And now, as of today, at 2.9, or just to make the maths easy, at 3, you can effectively say that demand for labor in the manufacturing market is still 50% higher than the long run average. So while we do still see that cooling in terms of the feverishness of demand for that labor, it is still 50% higher than the long run average. Now, looking at investment intentions, this is something that we saw in between 2020, in the intervening period between the fourth quarter of last year and the first quarter of this year. You can see where that orange bar ticks up. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with an earlier slide that we were looking at, where we saw the expectation for outputs in that corner to be quite negative, just moderately negative. What happened, there was a significant positive boom. We see the same here within those investment intentions in moving into the first quarter of the year. We don't see another similar boom, and indeed, unfortunately, we don't see those investment intentions even continue flat, but a very small downward change into the scale of positivity. But it's important to note they do still remain in positive territory, if not in a slightly pedestrian position in terms of the scale of those investment intentions. Next slide, please. This is a visualization of our forecast that I mentioned at the start. So, of course, we've seen if we focus on the middle section there, that is for the red bar manufacturing 2023 output forecast, or GVA forecast. That has been upgraded from last quarter. It was about negative -1.3 or something to that effect, around that territory. Similarly, an improvement in UK GDP as well, but not as such a similar improvement, and certainly not consecutive improvements to the forecast for 2024, because it is about the improvement in the outlook for 2023, especially seeing as such pessimism was set in Q4 of last year. And so we're seeing those revised upwards, but it doesn't necessarily go to say that we see much evidence to increase or revise upward our forecast for 2024 as of yet. Next slide, please. So this is exactly the same slide as the first slide. I think if I had two main messages to take away from this, is that we are seeing a degree of consistency that hasn't been seen really since 2018 in our data. Now, while it is only 2 quarters of consistency, we do have that evidence of the next quarter is expected to remain consistent as well. So this is very important about the business environment, very important about the ability for manufacturers to take a breath and stop daily firefighting and be able to focus on the more systemic challenges to their business. And it may be the signal of the start of that very slow, very low positivity, but that's in strong contrast to where we all were at the end of last year, where indeed government, the Office for Budget Responsibility, indeed the Bank of England, were all very confident that we were moving into a period of low and slow decline. So that's an important difference there. And of course, that allows business the space to plan investment and plan out their longer term strategy. The second point is around the relationship between prices and margins. So that's just very important for the sustainability of that industry and sustainability in terms of the amount of businesses we expect or don't expect to be in distress. Of course, when we had that huge gap between a very high price setting behavior and consistently declining margins, that obviously had us concerned about that. But now we're seeing, despite margins still remaining in negativity, that confidence that they're going to finally move into positivity in the coming quarter cools and allays some of those worries that we had, especially just how long the industry and line group could stomach 7 quarters of increasing prices but declining margins. I think the other important point about that is, though, despite these margins improving, of course, we have that concern about price levels, price setting behavior still remaining very high within the sector. And what are the wider implications for the UK economy? Particularly, that's why we have a more pessimistic view on the amount of pressure that's going to put at the end of the day on consumer inflation, as we're measuring here, the amount of supply side inflation happening within the manufacturing sector. It's somewhat inevitable that that's going to filter through to higher prices for the wider economy, or at least apply pressure to that over the longer term. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation, and I will now hand you over to Sandi.
Thanks, James. Hi, I'm Sandi Dosanjh, and I'm a partner in BDO's Digital Risk Advisory Services business. My background is centered around either assuring digital transformation or advising clients through their transformation journey. And I think it's important to first level set on what we mean by digital transformation. It's fast to become a buzzword that is being used quite broadly across industries. So from my perspective, digital transformation is the process of embedding technology across your business to drive change. In manufacturing specifically, it relates to the integration of technologies and processes to improve production efficiency and competitiveness. Now, from my experience, there are 3 components to it. The first is optimizing processes. For example, making the process of manufacture more lean and automated. This can reduce manual errors and improve production cycle times. The second is improving the customer experience through increased visibility and transparency from the moment that an order is placed all the way through to delivery of the product. And finally, empowering employees by reducing the time that they spend performing administrative effort, such as data entry. An example could be taking order data from one system and inputting it into a stock or product development system, and instead using that time to improve the business through innovation and precise decision making. An example of this innovation is moving systems into the cloud so that employees can work from anywhere. Because you could, for example, link your manufacturing facility that could be in China or India to your head office systems in the UK. And cloud computing is not just an example of digitalization in manufacturing, but it's actually becoming a global trend across industry because it allows for centralized data management, remote access, scalability, and real-time decision-making given the interconnectivity between systems. As Richard mentioned in the introduction, I did want to spend some time discussing the benefits. Why should an organisation invest their capital into transformation? What makes a solid business case for change? One reason could be reduction of manufacturing waste in the context of both human time and also materials. This actually plays to the ESG agenda as it promotes eco-positivity through lower resource consumption. Now, whilst profit might be the main driver for waste reduction, having a positive ESG outcome that can be reported on is a welcomed outcome for stakeholders such as shareholders. Secondly, it helps connect management to the production line. Digitization of the manufacturing process provides a wealth of information over product quality, quantity, and timing, and all of this can impact managerial decisions around fixed asset maintenance, product line investment, or even discontinuing products based upon demand and profitability. Another benefit is allowing technology to be tested sooner, as soon as it's being developed, which can actually reduce the time to take a product to market and gain a competitive advantage. Manufacturers can now also offer more customized and personalized products to meet individual customer needs, which then enhances brand differentiation. Another valuable benefit is that equipment and machinery can be monitored continuously, and that allows for predictive maintenance to take place and be accounted for. You can also get sight of potential problems being diagnosed with regards to manufacturing and machinery before they actually arise, which limits downtime and a reduction in production output. A final benefit is that it supports enhanced quality control. The ability to monitor information real time due to system capability allows early detection of issues when actual output is out of kilter with what you're expecting it to be. Now, at the moment, this all probably sounds quite theoretical, so I did want to share some examples of where we've seen digital transformation in manufacturing work very well. From a process point of view, production planning and scheduling can be digitized with centralized operations, and this speaks to the benefit that I mentioned of connecting management to the production line. You can see what's profitable, what is in demand, what is delayed, and adjust your manufacturing processes on a real-time and continuous basis. That helps avoid stagnant stock production or even over-ordering of parts. Data is being used as a trigger point now to sequence stages of manufacture to minimize downtime, because that allows key points in a cycle to be interconnected by various systems. An example could be a customer places an order and the requisitioning system will interface with a stock system to check if the components needed to fulfill the order are in stock. If yes, an automated instruction will then be sent to the production systems to start that manufacturing process. Or if the parts aren't in stock, it will trigger those required parts to be automatically ordered to then subsequently allow that order to be fulfilled. For some manufacturers, in an advanced context, robotics and automated systems play a big part within the production assembly line. Now, this allows 24/7 production, but also allows a predictable level of quality of output. Additive manufacturing is another example that organizations are investing in, which relates to things like 3D printing technology, which can be used to create parts and prototypes. This can reduce machinery downtime. It also allows prototypes to be developed quickly and assessed to reduce the time taken to get a product to market, which speaks to an earlier benefit that I mentioned around getting that competitive advantage. Now, some organizations within the manufacturing industry are creating digital twins of their manufacturing process. And what that allows you to do is simulate and predict performance for accurate management reporting. It allows sensitivity analysis to take place in a virtual environment without actually impacting your physical production process. So an example could be, if I increased production of a particular product by 58%, the digital twin would be able to give me an indication of the volume of parts that I need to order and what would be the impact on the performance of the machinery that's actually needed to produce more of that product. How would that impact depreciation? And what would then be the likely replacement time of key assets in that production cycle? Another example which speaks to the customer experience are customer and dealer portals, and this is very prevalent in the automotive industry in particular, as it allows products to be customized prior to the manufacturing process starting, and it provides visibility and communications with respect to that manufacture progress throughout the journey. That supports customer retention. Sometimes when manufacturing certain products, there is a long lead time between order and actual delivery of the product. So to be able to engage with the customer during that time period offers a distinct mechanism for customer retention. From an employee point of view, and a more traditional example is large data analysis and pattern formation. For example, data can show the level of output from one piece of machinery to determine its useful economic life and when replacement may be needed. Or more recently, where I've seen advanced generative AI being used, is where you can take a picture of a piece of machinery and the AI will determine the current effectiveness of that equipment and provide an indicative prediction as to when parts will need to be replaced. Another example is augmented reality and virtual reality, which is fast becoming a primary method for delivering training to employees for complex manufacturing processes, which then improves health and safety. Now, many of my clients are really keen to understand what foundations need to be put in place to make a digital transformation effective. And these building blocks are, in essence, the barriers to a successful transformation. There is a slide that I want to show now to visualize what should be put in place prior to embarking on a digital transformation project. You've popped it up, excellent. So these are, like I said, they're barriers, but they're also building blocks. It depends how you want to frame your assessment of what approach you should take before embarking on digital transformation. Starting at the top with strategy and innovation, having skills and knowledge in-house to have a strong vision of what digital transformation would and could look like. Now, this vision can't just be an IT-driven vision. It needs to be aligned to the business strategy and also consider the industry and the environment that the organization operates in. Certain laws and regulations could restrict the ability for a company to transform. An example could be pharmaceutical development or critical national infrastructure. Customer buy-in, as I mentioned as a benefit earlier, is also a barrier. If transformation impacts the way your business looks and feels to your customer, they need to go on the journey with you and ideally play a part in shaping what that customer experience looks and feels like. Now, this could be done through piloting certain products and processes and obtaining iterative feedback from a core customer base, which is then baked into a broader rollout. It also includes involving customers with training in the same way that we would train employees on new processes. By not involving customers in the transformation could be a major own goal because it pushes customers away to your competitors. So designing that customer journey upfront becomes a key success factor. Another potential barrier or building block is not having those clear use cases for your own automation case. With digital transformation being such a broad description of automation efforts, it can include processes that are inefficient or producing low quality output, and then checking whether these are viable candidates for transformation. An assumption that any process can be automated is a common misnomer. So it's really important to identify the use cases and then understand what technology is currently being used, not only to administer a particular process, but also how that connects to upstream and downstream processes. And that will then determine whether transformation is actually a worthwhile exercise, because it will compare your capital investment in technology that's needed versus the efficiency and savings that you could potentially gain through automation. Another reason or barrier could be organizational resistance. That can hamper efforts with regards to employees resisting change, either through fear or a lack of understanding of benefits. The employee journey is as important as the technology journey when it comes to determining what a successful outcome looks like. If the buy-in isn't there, people won't engage with the technology, which will then have a direct impact on the return on investment. Moving on to technology and AI, the maturity of existing tech and platforms. If the systems are out of date and have limited functionality, you're going to have a higher cost of entry because, first of all, you need to develop a technology ecosystem that responds to the needs of the business by being able to operate and connect with one another rather than just responding to the basic demands of your existing tech. And finally, looking at big data and analytics, the ability of your tech estate to provide a reliable data ecosystem where large volumes of data can be analysed and insights are generated will determine whether transformation is successful. The value in process automation is the richness of the data from the processes that you will then have access to, because this helps drive future investment decisions and, more importantly, where to discontinue efforts as well. If the capability to analyse the data isn't there, it's a huge missed opportunity for future successes. I will now hand over to the group for any questions.
Thanks, Sandi. It does require quite a bit of thinking about, doesn't it, this, to really understand where to apply it and where not to apply it. And I'm sure quite a few people on this call have probably had some experience of transformation programs around IT, and probably more broadly, around where they fail, where they go wrong. And that's kind of one of those barriers to going through this process is I guess, previous history and success of actually putting this stuff in place. I mean, just from your perspective, if you were to kind of pick off the key things that lead to, you know, digital transformation failing, what would those be?
That's a really well-placed question, Richard. And interestingly, according to McKinsey, only, I think, approximately 20% of digital transformations have been considered successful in achieving and, more importantly, sustaining the desired outcomes. And the reasons for that failure, I'd say one reason is a lack of vision or understanding of technology. You can't transform on top of poor or outdated technology. And what we saw during the pandemic was a lot of organizations were impulsively transforming on top of suboptimal technology. And even to this day, they're still carrying that post-pandemic debt. And it's because they've got a fragmented tool set and system landscape where none of the technology is integrated, leading to a higher cost of maintenance and integration, but without having the efficiency of that interconnectivity. Another reason would be limited leadership commitment. I think it's important to understand that transformation is a long-term commitment, both in terms of initial funding, but also the time to then see that return on investment. So the leadership team needs to be present, engaged, and sponsoring that transformation from start to finish. The change can't be technology-led, but it should be technology-enabled. Transformation can also fail because there's a lack of focus on customer training. As I mentioned earlier, the customer journey is super important. So I've seen organizations transform their customer journey, but then not actually invest in customer training in the same way they would for employees if it were a back office change. So then what ends up happening is customers refuse to engage with the new front-end process and still prefer to use traditional routes, which either lead to a loss of custom or duplicate cost, because an organization is then having to run two processes, the new automated digital process plus the manual traditional route in order to retain custom. Change resistance is another big driver for failure. I think there is a psychological component which is often underestimated when it comes to transformation. And I always encourage organizations to first try and change employee habits rather than pushing new system and change onto them, and then train users on a system after you've started to change those habits. Otherwise, you're going to create friction between the employee and the transformation program, which will then erode trust. And that typically is the reason why you can see attrition rates often increase during periods of intense transformation. And I think what's becoming clear to me is that digital transformation needs to be seen as an ongoing event rather than a one-time project. And that's because businesses evolve, right? As does technology. and therefore it requires constant adaptation, learning, and agility. Hence why it needs to be a constant feature on the board agenda to ensure that it doesn't become outdated and uncompetitive.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I totally agree with everything you just said. Looking at clients that I work with, the number of times you come across businesses where everyone thinks the technology and the transformation is going to totally change their business, but they all have a slightly different view of what that change is going to be. So right from the outset, the expectations aren't set, the requirement isn't defined particularly well, at which point, whatever you put in place seems to be a bit of a disappointment or an additional cost. So really helpful insights there, Sandy. Yeah, I think, you know, I've seen it plenty of times where things have gone really well, which is all around planning and really understanding what the requirement is in the first place and the core processes. And times when it hasn't gone well, when people have kind of said, right, we're going to put some digital stuff in, but don't quite understand what it is. The first bit is really to understand what the need is. So thanks very much for that, Sandy. Just in terms of Q&A, Bal, I'm going to hand over to you just to pick up any questions that we may have picked up during the call, and we'll pick those up as we go through. Over to you, Bal.
Thank you. We've had several questions come through. So James, if I pose a few of the questions which are for yourselves. Are there any signs that current UK policy on skills development is helping to build a stronger manufacturing workforce?
Yes, it's a good question. And I do think, because we do a lot of research with Make UK on this, we have a whole, as in effect, a specialist department that works on the labour market and advocates for those challenges within it. And as part of that, we do undertake a lot of research, and we have it as some of our bylines. So some of the evidence that I've gotten, and I've certainly got notes of it here, is that 44% of firms have increased their investment in training in only the last 12 months. So that's just shy of the majority. And apprenticeship recruitment intentions are also strong, and with the majority, more than 50% will recruit at least one apprentice in the next 12 months. Of course, this is despite the high-profile government initiatives like the apprenticeship levy still not working, quite infamously for many businesses, whether they're levy payers or SMEs. Apprenticeship starts do remain around a third below the number prior to the introduction of the levy, and are a further 2% down on the last academic year. But these new initiatives that you most likely might have heard of in passing, like the T levels, do have the potential to create a much stronger pipeline of talent through that balance of academic learning and work placements, that integration into industry. But there are still some doubts around this implementation, but it is something that Make UK is working, and our team is working almost directly with government on. And there are a number of practical barriers to employers offering industry placements to those 16 and 18-year-olds. And the defunding of the BTECs could also risk leaving behind young people who might miss out on the higher entry requirements to those more landed T levels. A final point on that is local skills improvement plans, which is that initiative, also offer the opportunity for employers to shape training provision in their given local areas. A bit from our research is that 47% of the industry do not believe that the local training providers are meeting their needs. And that same group, the local skills improvement plans are an opportunity to address this problem, especially given as the rollout of the higher technical qualifications and the lifelong loan entitlement, which is focusing on high level technical skills, will need a new provision to be developed.
Okay, thank you, James. And the next question is around the packaging sector. So whilst the outlook for manufacturing overall is positive, the manufacturing sector is still suffering from a downturn. Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, too, and especially the subsectoral conversation is always interesting. And perhaps over the past 2-3 years, we've seen some very, very bizarre, not bizarre, but wrong use of the word, but very interesting divergences, particularly emerging in that recovery, post-COVID recovery boom, where we saw some extremely high figures in given subsectors such as pharmaceuticals, and some particularly low figures in areas such as automotive, other transport, shipping and rail, those sort of industries. For the paper and packaging sector, The sector sort of followed the trend in 2022 in terms of, which wasn't a very positive trend, but didn't deviate from the aggregate, which is around negative 5%. I've got the table here actually, negative 5%. Paper and printing that year was a minus 5.7%. Where it is diverging is its expectations for 2023. Now, of course, I mentioned at the outset of my presentation that the aggregate view, or the updated forecast, was for minus 0.5% for the manufacturing sector. The paper and printing sector is still quite a way below that at minus 6%. So why is that? There's a couple of reasons here. I was actually only about a couple of weeks ago at one of our membership insight meetings where we have a very senior packaging manufacturer on that board, and some of the challenges around that three aspects: input supply, so things around getting shortages. There was actually a very large shortage in the cardboard supply chain over 2022 that bled into 23. Significantly shifting demand structure. So of course, that is plastic to cardboard, types of plastic, challenges around the compositions of plastics, which are all challenging manufacturers, paper and packaging manufacturers' typical production and challenges. And finally, demand. So not just demand for the type of product, but demand for packaging, full stop. And it's these challenges that effectively are unique to the sector, as opposed to the challenges that face all manufacturing sectors, that are causing this divergence that we're seeing in the 2023 forecast. Generally speaking, our expectation for the future for 2024 and onwards for the sector is for this to be a lagged moment, just not too dissimilar to what we saw to automotive in other transport, whereas we saw diverging performance for a year, but now those subsectors are playing catch up. We think we'll see this is disruptive moment for the subsector, but not necessarily a sort of seismic shift in permanent prospects, as we do expect that, along with many of other subsectors as well, we do expect it to return to positivity next year, and also for it to be a bit more, and because of that negative effect we've seen this year, for it to overshoot the aggregate next year as well in terms of our 2024 predictions.
Brilliant, thank you, James. Sandy, we've had one question come in around automation. So what percentage of overall processes in a manufacturing organisation should be automated?
Okay, that's quite a complex question to answer, given that there are so many options to automate within an organisation, and that's not just specific to manufacturing. For example, cloud migration is an example of automation that is across industry. If I focus my response to the question primarily on manufacturing processes, there's scope for 40 to 50% of time spent on manufacturing that could be automated by robots on a production line. I think 64% is what McKinsey argue as all manufacturing activity that could be automated. And it's worth noting that of this 64%, 80% of that relates to manufacturing in developing countries, with China and India being the largest. Now, given that labour is relatively cheap in these territories, at the moment, the business case is not yet compelling to transform, given that the cost of automation hasn't yet fallen below the wage levels in these developing countries. But when that does happen, and inevitably it will, as technology is adopted more and more to gain competitive advantage through quality of consistency and higher output, it is going to have significant implications for the labour markets in those countries.
Yeah, that's a really complex one to answer, isn't it? The answer is bound to be it depends, I would think. I guess in theory you could automate virtually everything, but the cost of that would be phenomenal, and therefore the return on investment wouldn't be there. So it absolutely depends on the size of the business, the growth profile of the business, and the level of investment that you're prepared to make in it. But you could, in theory, you could have a dark factory, the same as you have dark warehouses for the grocery industry. But the reality is far from that. And I guess the other point is how standardized is your process as well. So if you have standardized processes, then the opportunities far more straightforward. But if you're doing far more small batch, complex activities which change quite considerably, then the ability to have a technology that can allow you to do that is quite difficult. So yeah, my opinion would be, yeah, I'm sorry to say this, but it's one of those classic "it depends" answers from my side.
Thank you both. James, just one more question for yourself. Any thoughts on supply chain issues, updates with regards to China?
Yeah, I think there is, and I think I perhaps should have mentioned, leans on a little bit more in the presentation as giving an explanation, but I suppose we could talk about it all day as to why you might have remembered I was talking about that surprise improvement in performance between the end of last year and indeed the first quarter and moving into the second quarter. Two major factors at play. One of them is the reduction in the wholesale energy price, but the other major point is in that period, was also measured the greatest easement in supplier lead times in terms of the rate of that easement for something like 7 years. A lot of that coming from the East. It can often be dubbed, the golden screw moment, for lack of a better analogy. Effectively, what we saw is a huge easement in those inputs coming from the East, a lot of that China as well, that unlocked a lot of value stored in warehouses in the UK. So quite infamously, we saw a lot about this, and during COVID, this concept of whole warehouses fitted out with cars ready to go for lack of a single part. And now a lot of that was allayed in the first quarter of the year, and that's what the data as well illustrates, that we saw the expectation was not very good, and then suddenly a lot of that value was unlocked. That sort of happens once, of course, and that's why we haven't seen that happen twice, despite that supply chain remaining eased, but it is enabling that positivity. And perhaps I think it is fair to say it is one of the cornerstones that is enabling the UK's manufacturing outlook to remain consistent and positive at the moment, because we have seen such an easement in those supply lead times from the East that were becoming risible. That you wouldn't be able to get control equipment specifically. We hear a lot about that for love nor money, and you would be looking at lead times, perhaps 1,000% longer than what you'd become accustomed to. So in terms of the future of that, it always remains extremely unpredictable facet to predict, the supply corrections coming from the East. But it has been one of the major contributors and major improving factors of the outlook for UK manufacturing's prosperity in the short term in the past couple of quarters.